next item for consideration is H.R. 192 to prohibit individuals who are not citizens of the United States from voting in elections in the District of Columbia. The clerk will please report the bill.
H.R. 192, a bill to prohibit an individual who is not a U.S. citizen from voting in any election in the District of Columbia.
Without objection, the bill shall be considered as read and open for an amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered, the chair recognizes himself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will please report the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 192 as offered by Mr. Comer of Kentucky.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the substitute will be considered as original text for the purposes of further amendment. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and the amendment. Since the voters entrusted Republicans with control of the House, this committee has conducted long overdue oversight of our nation's capital city by convening 3 hearings on the District of Columbia. Our most recent D.C. hearing, held jointly with the Committee on House Administration, examined the topic of election integrity in the district. On November 21st, 2022, the district government enacted the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act, allowing non-citizen residents to vote in D.C. local elections. This includes illegal immigrants and even foreign diplomats whose interests may be opposed to the interest of Americans. This radical change to our election laws upset lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. D.C. Mayor Bowser withheld her signature on the act, something she has done only a handful of times. On February 9th, 2023, 260 members of the House voted to overturn the D.C. Act through a resolution of disapproval, which I sponsored. In that vote, I was happy to see committee colleague, Representative Jared Moskowitz, join 41 other House Democrats in voting to block this D.C. law. However, this bipartisan resolution of disapproval was not considered in the Senate, so D.C.'s non-citizen voting law has gone into effect. This is unacceptable. The only factor that differentiates American citizens from non-citizens is the right to vote. D.C. residents should be confident that their local government is not being diluted by lawful non-citizen residents or illegal immigrants. Article 1 of the Constitution grants Congress exclusive jurisdiction over the nation's capital. And the House rules charge the Oversight Committee with a duty to oversee the municipal affairs of the District of Columbia. I urge my colleagues to support Representative Pfluger's common sense bill to ensure that only U.S. citizens have the right to vote in local D.C. elections and repeal D.C.'s radical law. I now recognize the ranking member for his statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I would retitle this bill the Insult to Injury Bill. The injury begins with the massive and globally unique disenfranchisement of the residents of the federal capital city. The United States is the only democratic nation on earth which disenfranchises the people who live in the capital city, which means that there are 700,000 tax-paying, draftable American citizens who've participated in every war that America's ever fought, beginning with the American Revolution, and yet are denied voting representation both in the House of Representatives and in the United States Senate. But it's not enough for Mr. Pfluger and our friends in the GOP to deny 700,000 fellow citizens equal voting rights and representation in Congress. Now they have to deny D.C. even the right to decide who's going to vote in their local elections. Because that's all we're talking about, who's going to vote for school board and advisory neighborhood commission and who's going to vote for city council and mayor. There's one federal representative from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, the distinguished non-voting delegate from the District of Columbia. And under the legislation that H.R. 192 would repeal in D.C., the local population does not vote, even for the non-voting delegate, as I understand it. In any event, the non-voting delegate, by definition, doesn't get to vote in Congress. And so this is just pretty much a symbolic effort to add insult to injury. It so happens, if you actually do any research on this, that the vast majority of states permitted non-citizens to vote for most of American history. Most of the states represented in this committee allowed non-citizens to vote at the local level. Many of them allowed it even at the state and federal level. But when the Republic began, the relevant suffrage restrictions were based on wealth, property, race, and gender. And if you were a propertied white man, you could vote regardless of what your citizenship was. Your citizenship was considered completely irrelevant to it. And this primarily became an issue during the Civil War, where it was the Republican Party which championed non-citizen voting, which is why a number of newspapers in the South attacked Abraham Lincoln as an alien president, saying that he was carried to victory on the strength of the immigrant vote in New York and Illinois and in other states. The southern states opposed immigrant suffrage because they felt that immigrants were coming over to America with radical ideas against slavery, as Lincoln defended the practice of non-citizen voting. In any event, nothing remotely so controversial as what the Republican Party of the 19th century endorsed is going on in D.C. They're just talking about allowing people to vote in school board elections. Now, our friends have made a big deal out of diplomatic personnel from China and Russia, and perhaps Chinese spies like the one who apparently was going to be the star witness for the majority in their continuing efforts to find something on Joe Biden. These people theoretically would be allowed to vote. If you want to go after those people, well, then say that diplomatic personnel and Chinese spies shouldn't be allowed to vote. But if they're talking about, I don't know, 80,000 or 70,000 people, I don't know how many people exactly are affected by it, voting in their local school board elections, it's a very different matter than allowing diplomatic personnel from Russia or China, where conceivably there's some kind of federal interest, although it hasn't been identified or elucidated, at least to my satisfaction, what that might be. So what's this really about? It's just about kicking around the people of Washington, D.C. I don't think we've had any hearings about how we can actually assist the people of Washington in any of their efforts to deal with the problems there, including the problem of gun violence, as guns continue to pour into Washington, D.C., like other big cities across the country. If we want to actually help people in Washington, why don't we start by adopting the proposal which is advanced and endorsed by more than 90% of the American people, a universal violent criminal background check. Why don't we close the internet loophole? Why don't we close the private gun show loophole? There are things that we can do to help Washington, along with other big cities that exist in all of our states, but this is not one of them. This is obviously a cheap shot against the people of Washington who've decided to use their very limited democratic rights to extend rights to people who live in the city. With that, I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Do any other members wish to be heard? Ms. Norton's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose this undemocratic, paternalistic bill. This Congress, House Republicans have become obsessed with overturning the District of Columbia's election laws. They have already introduced 17 bills that would do so, yet they refuse to do the one and only thing D.C. residents have asked them to do about elections in D.C., which is to give D.C. residents voting representation in the House and Senate, as well as full control over their local affairs by passing the D.C. statehood bill. It is true that Congress has the constitutional authority to legislate on local D.C. matters, but it is false that Congress has a constitutional duty to do so. Instead, legislating on local D.C. matters is a choice. D.C. residents, a majority of whom are black and brown, are capable and worthy of governing themselves. I remind my Republican colleagues who claim to revere the founders what James Madison said in Federalist 43 about the residents of the federal district, and I quote him, "A municipal legislature for local purposes derived from their own suffrages will, of course, be allowed them," end quote. The Supreme Court has held that Congress may delegate full legislative power, their words, full legislative power to D.C. on local D.C. matters. Last year, the D.C. Council passed the Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2022, which allows non-citizens to vote, but only in local D.C. elections. This year, the House passed a disapproval resolution that would have nullified this legislation, but the Senate never took it up. The Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2022 is now law, and it should remain law. The Local Resident Voting Rights Amendment Act of 2022 only applies to local, and I stress local, D.C. elections. But there is a long history in the United States of allowing non-citizens to vote in local, state, territorial, and federal elections. At various points, 40 states have permitted non-citizens to vote. For example, Texas, the home state of the sponsor of H.R. 192, and Kentucky, the home state of the chair of this committee, used to allow non-citizens to vote. Today, more than a dozen municipalities allow non-citizens to vote in local, and I stress local, elections. The D.C. Council has 13 members. The members are elected by D.C. residents. If D.C. residents do not like how members vote, they can vote them out of office. Congress has 535 voting members. The members are elected by residents of their states. None are elected by D.C. residents. If D.C. residents do not like how the members vote, they cannot vote them out of office. The Revolutionary War was fought to give consent to the governed and to end taxation without representation. Yet D.C. residents cannot consent to any actions taken by Congress, including H.R. 192, and pay full federal taxes. Indeed, D.C. residents pay more federal taxes per capita than residents of any state, and more total federal taxes than 19 states, while being denied voting representation in Congress. I urge members to vote no on this bill, and I urge this committee to keep its hands off D.C. and pass the D.C. statehood bill instead. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair.